And he told me it may take a minute or two to go live. There we go. Welcome, everybody. We'll be waiting about 2 to 3 minutes to get started for those who are still in the middle of connecting. All right, welcome everybody. You can hear me. Had some put some notes and links in the chat window, so please check that out for some links that you can go to about the event, the recording, the rest of the series, and the community. We have a great topic, but a few reminders. First, feel free to ask questions at any time by typing them in the IM window. Be aware that any questions you post will be publicly visible. If you prefer, you can post your questions anonymously by checking the box right below where you enter the question. We've had a large number of people registered for this webinar. We're thrilled to see such interest, but it means that it may be impossible for us to respond to the large volume of questions in real time. We'll do our best, get to as many as we can. And there's a couple of folks here from the AIP team standing by, dedicated to answering your questions. So, but we wanted to provide additional mechanism to ensure everybody's questions get answered. Again, you can visit aka.ms/AIP Q&A, and you'll see the post dedicated to these questions. Note that this webinar is being recorded. It will be shared publicly. We will post the recordings on our community at the site listed in the chat window, aka.ms/AIP recordings. If for some reason you haven't seen the rest of the series, that's also on the link, aka.ms/AIP webinar. And please make a point of joining our community. That's the best way to ensure you don't miss any of this in the future. You can speak directly to our engineering teams. All of them are real active in reviewing them and commenting quickly and openly and honestly. So love hearing about and participating in private previews, feature requests, feedback, product roadmaps, in-person events, anything really you can think of about information protection and the other products provided by the Cloud and Artificial Intelligence product group. This is part of a 6-part webinar series. This is part 4 on Azure Information Protection. We'll be walking through this series. We've gone through all the major aspects. Enrique will, I think, review those at least by name at the beginning in case you've forgotten, but showing how to deploy and configure on each part. And today's topic is focused on protecting data at rest and in motion. So with all that preamble out of the way, I'd like to introduce you to our presenter, Enrique Sagasti. He is, and pardon me for mispronouncing your name after so many years, but Enrique is one of the, you won't like it when I say this, but I got to think he's one of the world's leading experts on Azure Information Protection. Technically, he is the principal program manager for our team and part of what we call our Get to Production group. He's helped dozens, hundreds of customers representing hundreds of thousands and millions of users deploy and configure AIP. He knows all the tricks of the trade and has deep expertise in this project, in this topic. So hopefully I didn't overpromise. That's on you, Enrique. Let me introduce Enrique Sagasti. Here you go, Enrique.
Thank you very much, Michael. I actually do like when you say that. Hello, everyone. As just introduced, I'm Enrique Sagasti, a program manager with the Information Protection team, and I'm here to talk about one of my favorite topics, which is protection, and specifically within Microsoft Information Protection, the encryption and protection aspects. Just to recap a little bit, what is Azure Information Protection and what it does, let's spend a few minutes of that so we put this topic into context. Traditionally, many years ago, you could protect your data by keeping it in a secure environment. You secured your users or the identity of your users, you secure your devices, you secure your applications, and as a result of that, your data was protected because it was always within those devices, used in those applications, and by those users. That used to be easy in the old on-premises world where everything was behind a firewall, being inside your building, and nothing needed to go anywhere else. So you achieved your objective of protecting the data by protecting the environment in which the data was. That is no longer possible. The world has changed, and now we have cloud services, we have web services that you might not even know they exist and your users are using. You have roaming users, road warriors, home users. You have partners, customers, other people that need to access sensitive and important data that you have, and that are going to use it in devices, applications, and services you have absolutely no control over. And that data needs to be at least as secure when it's in the locations, devices, applications, services, and used by people that you do not control, as it was expected to be when it was in your on-premises controlled, secure environment. So that's where Microsoft Information Protection solutions come in. And Azure Information Protection is one of the key components of this Microsoft Information Protection architecture. Its objective is to protect your sensitive data through its life cycle, wherever it goes. So from the moment the data is created or comes into your view until the moment it's deprecated, deleted, erased, or whatever it happens to it, the data needs to be secure, and that's what we do with AIP. We do that by following 4 basic steps, and actually we do these across all Microsoft Information Protection solutions. The Microsoft Information Protection, to be clear, for those that missed the announcements, it's not a product, it's an architecture and a family that composes multiple products, but it's also a model that we apply across products to secure your data. And it's also even actually a small piece of code is the MIP SDK or MIP DLL that runs behind most of Microsoft's cloud-based services that implement 4 key elements of the protection. One of them is the discovery phase, in which we use different techniques to find out that something exists. Either a user tells us there's a document here and it's confidential, or we scan the content and discover that contains credit card numbers, and then we say, okay, there's a document here that's named this way that contains credit card numbers, or through many other means, we figure out that a document exists. We use the MIP SDK, the MIP DLL, to say, hey, there is a piece of content here, please let me know what's in there. And as a result of that, we go into the next step, which is the classification step. In the classification step, we basically tag the document according to what we discovered. For example, the document might be tagged as confidential, it may be tagged as public, personal, whatever you tell your classification taxonomy to be. And we do that tagging by adding a label to the document or multiple labels. Those labels are metadata in the document that are persistent and that follow the document wherever it goes, and that can be read by computers. So for example, Office or SharePoint or some other application might read the label and say, okay, this is confidential, so I need to treat it this way. It includes visible markings, so users can also know what they're dealing with. It includes additional information about the document being logged into a central database. So basically, you're creating an inventory of your documents as you discover and classify them. For example, if you discover the document contains credit card numbers and that as such it's confidential, we will take record of that document and say there is this document here that contains this information that was created by this user in this location, and all that information is kept in a central place. So you basically have a full inventory of all the information that matters to you. The next step, and the one about which we're going to be talking today, is the protection element. It sounds a little bit confusing because we're talking about Microsoft Information Protection. Information protection includes protection. That should be the central element, but it's actually just one of the components of MIP. The protection element also takes multiple forms. The most basic one is encryption. You cannot really protect something if it's not encrypted, unless you keep it in a single location that you don't let people to get to. So encryption is one of the elements. But then we have also access controls, saying that only John and Peter can access this document and Mary can't. Again, these protection, encryption, and the access controls are also traveling with the data. So we're not protecting a location, we're protecting the data itself. So when the data moves around, that encryption and those access controls persist. We also apply usage restrictions, for example, saying John can view this document and Peter can edit and print. So essentially defining those individual rights adds additional protection on top of what we had by just encryption and granting access controls. In addition to that, we can apply other levels of protection. We're going to be talking about those later in a bit more detail, but essentially we can restrict where the data goes. So we can say you cannot save this document in this location, or you cannot share it with this user. It cannot go through the firewall. It cannot cross or be stored in this service because one of our solutions in the MIP stack is going to block it. So essentially you have a multifaceted approach to protect your data, and we're going to go and cover all those during this webinar. Finally, the fourth step in the information protection step is monitoring. Through all that life cycle, when the document gets shared, it moves, people open it, we are taking notice of every action that happens. So when somebody opens the document, when somebody shares the document, when the document is discovered in this location, when the document is stored here, we continue enhancing that inventory with a record of everything that happens. So in addition to have a full inventory of the information in your organization, you also know where it is, what's going on with it, who's accessing it, how it is classified, how it was used, and which changes in classification were made to it, and which changes in the content happened. One important aspect is that this is a cloud solution, but it's not only for the cloud. It's implemented thanks to the Microsoft Information Protection architecture across all your devices, all your applications, cloud services, and also on premises. So you don't have a solution that is based on the cloud that protects your stuff that's in the cloud. And then whenever something is outside of the cloud, then it's fair game. No, the idea is that we want to protect your data everywhere, and we do so by sharing this SDK across multiple products, among them AIP, the AIP scanner, Windows Defender ATP, Windows Information Protection, and lots of other things that we're going to be describing that work both in the cloud and on premises and cross premises. So as I said, this life cycle of the document starts when data is detected. Then the document is classified, labeled, and basically we say, well, we have a document here that contains this kind of information, and as such, it is confidential. Or maybe it's just the user that tells us that the document is confidential. Or maybe the computer says this is confidential, and the user says, no, this is top secret, because in addition to containing credit card numbers, it's also talking about, I don't know, this Contoso acquisition. Oh, yes, this is a credit card number, but it's the CEO's credit card number. So we need to take special care. So it's an interactive process that lets you to have the most accurate classification possible. And then the data is protected. As I said, it is not protected through a single method. There are multiple methods in action, but they're all derived from the sensitivity, from the classification of the data. You don't have to ask your users to protect the data. Users might help you make a decision about what the data is, but then the decisions about how to protect it should be done by the solution itself. Users are normally not very well qualified to make security decisions, but they should know what they're working with. Then after the data is protected, you can let it travel to anywhere where it needs to go. You prevent it from going to where it should not go. For example, this data should stay inside my firewall. This data can travel to my partners, but not go to unsanctioned cloud locations, or this data can go everywhere and it's still going to be protected. And through all that, you get that reporting and monitoring that I mentioned before. So let's, one more step. At the end of the life cycle, data can be retained, expired, deleted, and AIP can also help you with that. Even though the data retention policies are a component of Office 365 that are not directly implemented through AIP, they are connected to AIP because they can be based on labeling, it can be based on classification, and they have interactions with the discovery components in Microsoft Information Protection. So data retention policies, while not a feature in AIP, are closely related to information protection. And probably the best way to protect something is to delete it. So it is part of the protection aspect of information protection. So let's talk today about the protection side of AIP. Protection includes multiple facets, as I mentioned before, among them encryption, the restriction of access, so essentially saying who can do what and what they can do. Watermarks, headers, footers, other content markings, so users know how to deal with this data. This is sometimes seen as part of the labeling because it's the visible side of labeling, but it's also protection, because one of the most effective ways to ensure people don't do the wrong thing with documents is to let them know that they should not be doing those things. If you put a header that says do not share with externals, users are more likely to follow that advice. And also, they know that they cannot say, oh, it was an honest mistake. I didn't know I couldn't share this with the wrong people, because it says it right there at the top of the document. So it is a component of protection. And governance policies are also a component of protection. As I mentioned before, deletion is a key element. Things like GDPR or other regulations that talk about the life cycle of documents and talk about privacy rights have mandates for deleting certain data, and also have mandates for taking very good care of sensitive data. And if you're keeping data that's 30 years old that you have no business with anymore, why are you spending a lot of effort in monitoring and managing and securing that data when you could just delete it? So governance is closely associated with information protection. One of the key steps in an information protection plan is to define your strategy. And for that, you need to understand your data and understand how you're going to manage it. And in general, this can be seen as a pyramid, where at the base you have the data that is completely public, everybody can see it. You don't have any restriction to apply, and you can let it go everywhere. That can go from an announcement that was already made public to a document that is just not sensitive in nature. You're writing an email saying, I don't know, hey, let's meet for lunch at 3 p.m. That might not be exactly public information, but doesn't need restrictions unless you are a VIP, and nobody cares if it gets leaked. So that data can be considered the public stuff, and it can be granted access to anyone, and there is no need to protect it. Then, on top of that, you have the information that your whole company should be able to see, and that you might not enforce tight restrictions. For example, an internal announcement to the whole company, or a internal mail about or document about design or feature that it's planned to be made public, or an edit to a document is not intended for external consumption, but if it goes outside, you're not particularly worried. So you can provide guidance to the users of how and when to share it. You let it to their discretion, that they say, okay, I need to share this with a partner. I'm not particularly concerned about where it goes, so I'm not going to apply any restrictions, and I leave it up to the users. Then you have classified data that's departmentalized, and you or maybe departmentalized. For example, it might be a document that is not for the whole organization, but only for the marketing division, or for this particular product or engineering team. These cases, you don't want the information to circle across the whole company. You want it to be limited to specific divisions or departments. So you need to create policies that limit it as such. And many companies, they don't do this. They just tell people, do not share this outside of this group, because the users are your employees. You're supposed to be able to trust them to do their jobs. So you don't need to apply compartmentalized restrictions. But in some companies, they do that, and in some companies, they have good reasons to do that, because these projects are either regulated or completely independent, or there are ethical firewalls that establish separations between duties and divisions. So you can apply specific restrictions to do that. On top of that, you have the data that is to specific small groups. We are planning on acquiring this company, so the team that is planning the acquisition is just a need-to-know basis, because the public information of that acquisition could affect the market price or break regulations. Or you have a conversation with your boss about a particular incident, or you have a PII that is specific to an employee, and you're in the HR department, so you need to keep these restricted to as few people as possible, and that goes slightly above the compartmentalized information. Finally, you have what we call the crown jewels, the top secret information that is highly regulated. It should never go anywhere other than the people that are allowed to have access to it. And for example, in some cases, you may have critical IP, or for example, in the oil and gas industry, they have these exploration spreadsheets where they discover the results of some technical research and discover, yeah, there is oil down there, before they have bid for the exploitation of those resources. That's a billion-dollar spreadsheet. You don't want it to be circling around even across large parts of the organization. So you want it to be tightly restricted to just a few users. Once you understand your data, you understand what it fits everywhere, where it fits in your story, how it needs to be protected, and more importantly, from whom it needs to be protected. You need to think of the threats to each of them. And this is very important, because many companies have this backwards when they start playing with AIP, and they think of protection as, what do I want to allow? What will this user should be able to do with this document? Instead of actually thinking on what they're trying to prevent. And if you think one way or the other, the resulting policies are quite different. For example, you may have a document that people, you assume, that don't have to print and don't have to copy. So you don't give them those rights and you only share it with these 10 people. But it turns out that somebody else needs to have access to this information. And since these users don't have to print the right to print or copy this information, they cannot share it with this person. And you have to start changing your policies after the fact, and people are obstructed from doing their jobs, etc. On the other hand, you could think of, okay, who's my enemy? Who am I trying to prevent to get to this data? And I say, well, that's my competition, or that's hackers, or that's whatever is your biggest fear. And they say, well, what do I need to know or to do to make sure that those people don't get access to this data? And that leads to a completely different policy. You're not going to say, well, give access to everybody but the competition. But you can say, if anybody in my company finds out about this data, no big deal, as long as they cannot accidentally share it with those people. If they intently try to share it with these people, I will assume that it's for good reason. That's a valid assumption in many cases. It's not a valid assumption in every case, so policies may vary, but in most cases, you can have sensitive information to which all your employees have the right to share externally, as long as they do it intently and by following multiple steps to ensure that it doesn't happen accidentally. So accidental leakage is the most common form of leakage. If you look at the vast majority of reports in the media about data leakage, they are somebody did something silly with the data. They put in the USB drive and lost it. They put it in the wrong location. They stored it in an insecure location. They forwarded it to the wrong person. Those are a big problem. And those are prevented by even the minimum levels of protection. If you ensure the data is protected and has an access control list that says only these people can open it directly, but these people can do whatever they want with it, that's enough for preventing accidental leakage. Then you have accidental loss, like, my laptop turns out not to be encrypted and I lose it and somebody steals the data. Well, that is slightly different because you're relying on your identities and the devices to be protected. But if they are not, the access controls and re-encryption in the information protection solution applied to the documents should prevent that as well. And you don't need to be very tight on the restrictions because the hacker is not going to have your password. And if they do, it's not accidental loss. That's a completely different scenario. Then you have opportunistic theft, somebody that sees a device and steals it. And it's similar to the previous one, just the most basic protection will take care of it. Targeted theft. In those cases, it's possible that somebody also steals a password or hacks an account. So in those cases, you may need to apply additional restrictions and implement additional controls like reporting and alerting in case the data gets stolen or the device gets stolen and you can take action. Then you have the cases of the malicious insider. That is very rare in most markets, but it's a problem in some specific markets. Normally, it's an overblown threat because if you think about it, if there is a malicious insider that wants to share or steal some data, they can always write it on paper. They can always pick up the phone and tell somebody what they're reading. They can always memorize the data. So if they are really malicious, they are determined and they get access to the content, then there is very little you can do to stop them. That said, you want to make their jobs harder. That's not a security task, making the job of the hacker harder. You should make the job of the hacker impossible. So this cannot be considered a security capability, but you want it for compliance or for making things just simply better. You want to ensure that a malicious user cannot cannot leak the data without going through some effort, because that eliminates deniability, and that typically dissuades the vast majority of potential malicious insider. If the data is just unprotected, the user can just say, I'm going to put it here just in case. If the user needs to go through multiple steps, like taking a picture of the screen and then applying OCR to that picture or things like that, that's a completely different story, and the vast majority of such incidents will not happen. Finally, there is something that is not directly related to security, but sometimes you have a fiduciary responsibility to protect some specific data. Things like PII that might be affected by regulations like GDPR or LGPD or a few others. Whether you consider that they are vulnerable or not, whether you consider that this is your duty or not, you are mandated to apply some controls over this data. So if you do not protect your data to the best of your abilities, you may be in non-compliance. And that might involve just applying protection via encryption. It might involve applying access controls. Typically, it also involves monitoring this data so you know what you're dealing with and you can report and you can respond to obvious data requests such as the data subject request defined in many of these laws and regulations. But the point is, if you think of these individual threats and maybe other threats that you can define that are applicable to your business, you lead to a suitable policy in your environment. So let's talk about what you can do once you define your threats. You can apply multiple controls. Obviously, nothing is secure if your identities, devices, and everything else is not secure. And I said that your data needs to go into devices that might not be secure because it needs to be shared in devices that belong to other people. But in the end, if the device is not secure at all and the user is able to log in there, the hacker or attacker or thief can just steal the password of the user, the device of the user, even the phone of the user that can be used to authenticate this user. So in the end, the hacker is the user. If you cannot differentiate between a good user and a bad user, then there is no information protection. So some level of device protection is important. I mean, ensure that if a device is stolen, you can be wiped and that they have authentication and that at least the minimum level of encryption. That makes total sense in the context of an information protection strategy. Separate from that, you can apply file encryption. And we're going to talk about file encryption in a few minutes. But essentially, your documents need to be encrypted and need to be ACLs, access control lists, that say this document can be viewed by these users, they cannot be viewed by these other users, and rights controls such as this document can be printed, this document can just be viewed. You can implement referring to anything that says this document can go here or cannot go here. And those can be associated with the protection and policies defined by AIP. So if you have a document that is confidential, internal, you might establish a DLP rule that says this document cannot go through the firewall or cannot be stored in a public location. Or I'm going to trust OneDrive for Business for this data, but I'm not going to trust OneDrive Personal, so I'm not going to let it be stored there. So those are secondary controls, because if the information is encrypted and has access controls and all that, it doesn't matter where it goes. But it's much easier to keep things in order if you prevent the wrong data to go where it shouldn't. Also, there are things that may not be protected via encryption and access controls, but that you just, for the sake of keeping things orderly, you don't want them to go to the wrong place. So, for example, if I have a conversation with Kevin about one of our product plans, it might be internal, not confidential. Let's say we have a label that's Microsoft internal. That's for internal consumption only. It has no business going outside, and I could block it via DLP actions. Now, sometimes we have to involve a third party into that conversation. So the right thing to do will be for either Kevin or I reclassify that document as Microsoft external or general or whatever external. That way, now it can go through the firewall. The protection of the data itself via encryption access controls didn't change because there was none to begin with, but it can now go outside, and the benefit to the business is that now we know that that was intentional, that it wasn't an accident that this data ended up in the wrong hands. So you gain a lot of insight into how your protection is working. You can also use policy tips and notifications associated with these policies. You may have a policy that says, well, internal data is not protected, but you're trying to send it outside of the company. And you know that's not allowed, right? So you should reclassify or review your decision. That kind of policy tip, again, helps ensure that people are doing the right thing, and if they do something, it is intentional. You can put visual markings in documents, as I mentioned before. Putting something at the top of the document that says this is confidential makes wonders to ensure that users are not going to be negligent. I receive an announcement, and it says, hey, next week we're going to announce this product, and I have a friend that's dying to know about this new product. Maybe it's the Xbox V Next, and I trust my friends, and I say, hey, I'm going to share this with him. But it has a big thing that says confidential, do not share outside the company, we will cut you. That it's kind of a big dissuading element, and I'm not gonna share that data just because I know that, yeah, I cannot say it was an accident. It's right there, and I cannot play dumb when I did something silly and I get caught. You can apply granular policies at the service level. So, for example, you can tell SharePoint Online to enforce these policies, to do this, that. And you can implement things like anomaly detection. So if this document is being accessed from an unusual location, if lots of documents are being accessed by this user using a device that we've never seen before, that kind of thing can tell a lot about the level of risk. And we have the abilities to report on those things to make sure that you have early detection in case something wrong happens. Like, for example, if somebody steals an identity and is using it to steal lots of data, you probably can detect that even though the access is legitimate from the identity point of view, but you're seeing it from the wrong location, wrong usage patterns, wrong device. So the Microsoft Information Protection Stack, the integration between AIP and Azure Advanced Threat Protection, Azure Active Directory Advanced Threat Protection can help you detect that kind of event. Finally, data retention, expiration, and deletion. Those are not, as I said, AIP features, but they are implementing Office 365 governance capabilities, and they connect with classification and content discovery, so you can take actions for retention and expiration and deletion based on how users, what is in the data and how users classify the data. Even though it's not a direct match, it's not like you can say data that is confidential needs to be retained for 5 years, because that actually your customers told us makes no sense. But you can use the existing labels to make decisions about data retention, expiration, and deletion. So let's talk a little bit about the rights. When a document gets protected, the first thing it happens is that the document is encrypted, and we encrypt it with a random symmetric key, and we create a policy and embed that symmetric key in the policy. We define the rights of different users on this document, and we encrypt that policy with the organization's key. We're going to see in a minute how that actually happens. But the important thing here is that those rights enforcement policies, where you say you can view but you cannot copy, are secondary controls. If you don't trust someone, you should not get this person get access to this content. You should not allow them to even see the content, because if you do, they can always just retype it. They can always just write it down on paper. So there is only so much that you can do to stop them from maliciously leaking the data. So just restricting the data from going to the wrong people is the first step in security. And for that, the access controls component saying only people at Contoso can view this content, or only people in marketing, or only John, is the right step. Now, once John or marketing or Contoso has access to his data, saying they cannot copy, they cannot forward, they cannot print, is a secondary control that in turn prevents the wrong people from getting data, access to this data, people that you trust less. Let's say you trust your company and you trust your partners, but you trust your partners less than you trust your company because you cannot, for example, train your partners in your internal policies normally. So what will happen is that you give rights to the document that says only Contoso has access, and people at Contoso are properly trained. They have the right to view the document. They don't have the right to copy the content. Now, if they did have the right to copy the document, they could copy the content, put it in another document, and share it with Contoso, even unintentionally, and then share it with the partner. And the people at the partner will not know how to deal with this data. They will not have any access restriction. They might share it even further. Whereas if the content is protected from copying, users are not going to end up putting this document into this content in a document that is not protected, and the document is not going to go into the hands of your partner that you trust a little bit less, unless a user makes a conscious decision and they say, okay, I need to share this with my partner Fabricam. I'm going to change the policy in this document, or I'm going to request my manager that changes the policy in this document, whatever your policies say that they have to do. They change the policy, they grant rights to Fabricam, they share it with Fabricam, and Fabricam has access, but the document is still protected, and Fabricam cannot share it with other people or lose it or make the same mistake that I mentioned before that the user could have made. So that's the role of these rights enforcement, is preventing negligent or just plain innocent actions that could end up in the data being leaked. At the same time, it is a strong tool because it prevents the data from getting into the hands of other people without protection. Remember, you can copy data, you can copy it into a document that has no protection whatsoever, and then it can go into the hands of everyone. So you're not trying to protect via this right from your enemies. You're trying to protect from your friends and family making a mistake that could result in the data being in the hands of your enemies. So that's the role of rights enforcement in the whole picture. And let's talk a little bit. I'm not going to go into too much details. We documented this in the in our technical documentation, but these are the flows for document protection and consumption. And at the core, as I said, when we encrypt a document, or when we protect a document, we encrypt it, we create a policy, we embed rights into the policy, and then we make the whole thing self-contained. A hacker gets this file, it's an encrypted blob, there's nothing they can do with it. They cannot open, they cannot view. The only thing they can do is to request a license. So when you open the document in Office, Office is going to see that the document is protected, and it's going to make a call to Azure Information Protection. It's going to say, hey, I am John, and I need access to this document. And the service is going to say, okay, prove that you're John. It's going to ask for authentication. And if authentication happens successfully, it will check the policy in the document and say, okay, what rights does John have on this document? It will analyze the policy in the document. It will decide whether the user gets rights. It will decide which rights it gets. And if all works out well, the user will get a license. That license will be sent to the device. The device will interpret this license, and it will say, should you be able to render this document? Should you be able to print it? Should you be able to copy it? And then it enforces those rights in the application. It's important to highlight that these rights are enforced by the application, and the application should always do the right things, but they cannot always be guaranteed to do so. So if somebody says, hey, AIP is broken because I can write this application that can bypass the print right or the copyright. Yeah, so what? You gave the right, you gave the content to this user, so you're not assuming it's your enemy. And that's not the role of AIP to prevent your enemies from copying the document. The role of AIP is to prevent your enemies from getting the document in the first place. So we always say that AIP's role is to keep honest users honest and keep the bad guys out. There is no such thing as keeping the bad guys honest. So don't just think in terms, how can I prevent my enemies from printing this document? Because that will never work. No, it's not a technical limitation. If the user can view the content, they will always be able to share it, even in the perfect system. So one of the most important aspects in an AIP deployment is the definition of the right policy. We provide a set of default policies in the service, and those are suitable for an initial deployment, but then you're going to want to tweak it and tweak these policies and define something that works. What you see on screen is something that is closer to what most of our customers end up with, because it includes considerations for external sharing. It includes considerations for blocking accidental sharing of internal content that is unprotected. So for example, you may have a non-business policy that says this is personal, or this is stuff that does not strictly relate to the business, so we're not going to protect it. But even if we tell users, do not create personal stuff in your workstations, you want to create this label, because the worst thing that can happen is that users are doing that, are creating that content, and you don't know about it. So at least let them be honest and ensure that when there is something that is non-business, you know about it. Then you have the public policies not protected. Then you have standard business, which is not protected because it's regular stuff that doesn't have any confidentiality level, but you want to differentiate between internal and external content, and you want to define two sublabels for those. And maybe for the internal stuff, even though it's not encrypted or protected via access controls, You can say, build a DLP rule or a client alert rule that says these data cannot go outside without the user's consent, or I'm going to ask the user to reclassify the data before sharing. And then for confidential data, you can also create multiple labels, sublabels that apply different levels of restrictions and protection. So for example, for something like external restricted, you can tell the user to protect the data. You're not automatically applying a policy. And actually, this is something I should have mentioned before. There are two types of protection policies. Administrator-defined policies and user-defined policies. And you can define either of the two in a label. So you can have a label that says, this content is accessible to everyone in Contoso, and they get view, edit, save, forward, copy, reply, etc. And then you can have another label that says, I don't know, I'll ask the user. So when you choose one, it just applies some rights and encryption and access controls. When you choose the other one, it's going to pop up something and it's going to tell the user, hey, tell me who this data should be for. We have that for documents. We have something similar for emails, but in emails, we don't ask the user who they are sharing with because we already know it's right there in the to field in the email. So we use that information and we just apply rights, grammar rights to the users in the to and CC lines. Both have their role, and some companies are heavier on the user-defined protection than others. We generally recommend using administrator-defined protection as much as possible because it's easier to use, it's more flexible, it gives you a lot of benefits. But if you're dealing with like tens of thousands of projects, you cannot define tens of thousands of labels. So if you need to create compartmentalized policies for those projects, you might want to use user-defined protection. The other scenario where user-defined protection is very common is external sharing. If you have 5 partners, you can create a label for each partner. If you have 10,000 partners like Microsoft does, you cannot create 10,000 labels. So you let users define something like user-defined protection. Yeah, I'm sharing these with my partner XYZ, so I'm going to apply my own protection and I give them rights during the labeling process. And sometimes you give a way out to users and you create a confidential and restricted label. It's important that you let your users know that they should not use that as the default. And in fact, you have some ability to control which labels are easy to use and which labels are hard to use because they're more hidden. We're not going to go there because it was covered during the labeling session, but essentially something like internal and restricted could be basically a fallback. If you use that one when encryption or access controls will be a problem. And that actually is important today because lots of applications do not support AIP. And one example is SharePoint Online. It doesn't render protected documents. So you can put protected documents in SharePoint Online, but then you lose the web view, search, and a few other capabilities like co-authoring. So you might say, well, I need this full functionality in these documents. So I'm going to apply confidential, internal, and restricted. Hopefully in a few months, we will have that support in SharePoint Online, and lots of other applications are already integrated or being integrated with AIP this way. So this scenario where you need to define an unrestricted policy for certain content is beginning to fade and become less important, but it's something to keep in your arsenal for now. Finally, you want to differentiate what's confidential from what's highly confidential, the stuff that is absolutely critical that nobody that shouldn't see sees. And for that, you typically apply much more restricted controls like view, edit, reply all, and that's it. You cannot forward, you cannot copy, you cannot print. Now, then is the case where, well, yeah, this person is not in the original list, but they need access to this content. This is a legitimate case. How do I get them access? So it's good to give a way out to users. One common tactic is to define a role, for example, managers or mid-level managers or upper-level managers or some specific role that is close to the user and give them full control. You trust those users. You're not afraid that they might be trying to leak this data. And based on that, you give them the right to do whatever they need to do with the data. So if I am a regular employee and I need to share this document with a partner, I can't because it's highly confidential, but I need to. So I go to my manager and say, hey, can you reclassify this as partner confidential because it needs to be shared with a partner? And then they give me a version that has partner confidential sharing or confidential external restricted or whatever I call it, and then I can share this data. And the important thing is that require an authorization to go through. Two users needed to think about it to make sure that it wasn't a mistake, and the data was reclassified, so I get full tracking of what happened there. It didn't happen accidentally. This document got relabeled, and it was specifically shared with a partner intentionally, so I'm sure that things are being done properly. When it comes time to define your policies, you can define protection actions. You can define a type of key. We're going to cover that in a second. Then you can grant rights to the users. As you see here, you have those two options that I mentioned: set permissions, which is admin defined permissions, and then set user defined permissions. If you choose the first one, it's going to ask you who are you granting rights to and which rights, as you see here. If you choose the option to do user defined permissions, it's not going to ask you anything. It's going to ask the user when the time comes to label a document with this data. If you choose set permissions, you need to ask to define the recipient. So in this case, my whole company, marketing, John at Fabricam, whatever, and I can grant individual rights like co-owner, co-author, reviewer, viewer, or you can choose a custom policy and say view and save and print or something like that. I can select external users. I can enter the whole domain of Fabricam. I can enter marketing of Fabricam, or I can enter John at Fabricam, or I can enter users in my directory by browsing it. I can also apply restrictions like content expiration, allow offline access, define a duration of offline access, etc., which is important for the purpose of revocation and tracking, because if I allow offline access, tracking is not as effective as if users need to acquire a license every time they access the content, and the same thing goes for revocation. So, about keys. When you protect something cryptographically, there is always a root key of its protection that is in the end what's actually protecting the document. And in the case of AIP, we have one active root key per organization. It's called the tenant key. Or the server license or certificate if you want to be more geeky. And there are three types of keys that will allow you to create. One is the MS Managed, Microsoft Managed. That is the key that is created by default. Microsoft creates this key, we manage it, we take care of it, we handle it very securely, but it's not under your control, it's under ours. And you need to be rest assured that we're doing the right thing. We have very strict policies about the management of these keys, and we're very disciplined. We have a large organization of people that are dedicate their lives to protecting these keys, which is something that most customers will never be able to afford. But it is not a key that is under your control, so some customers think that they need more. And for that, we have Bring Your Own Key. In the case of Bring Your Own Key, the key is also hosted in the cloud, but it's created by you in typically in your own hardware security module, like you buy a Thales hardware security module, and in Cipher unit, you create a key there, and then you synchronize it with Microsoft in a way that is opaque to Microsoft. Even during the transaction, we cannot see this key. We cannot export the key. We cannot share this key. Even with a concerted effort across Microsoft, there is no way in which we can take this key out of the hardware security module, because that's how this piece of hardware is designed. And your key is under your control. We can use the key. So we have the key and we can use it to provide you with the service. So you should not think that because you're using Bring Your Own Key, Microsoft cannot decrypt your content, because that's the whole thing we do. We decrypt your content to render it in exchange, for example. But we cannot take your key out and give it to somebody else by mistake or by negligence or via a court order or whatever. We cannot take the key out of an HSM. And that makes customers much more confident and that they are in control of the key when that's what they need. For most companies, the Microsoft Managed Key is enough. But for regulated environments, in many cases, Bring Your Own Key is considered a must. Finally, we have a third way of handling the keys, which is Hold Your Own Key. Hold Your Own Key, you keep the key on premises, you run it on premises, and your content is protected with an on-premises key. So this has very significant drawbacks. It's a much more limited option. It doesn't allow any integration with the cloud whatsoever. So your content is opaque to any cloud service, which is by design. That's what you want. If you don't want to give us the key, you don't want to give us the rights to decrypt the content. That will defeat the purpose. The content cannot go outside of your organization. The content can not be viewed in third-party applications outside of your on-premises environment, et cetera, et cetera. All those restrictions are by design. You want to keep your key on premises. It is because this content is so sensitive that nobody else should see it. So that's what we do. But it has those trade-offs. So you never should use, if you choose to use hold your own key, which you shouldn't in most cases, but if you choose to use it, never use it alone, because if you do it, then all your content that is protected will be protected with hold your own key. And any content that is not able to accept those restrictions, so for example, partner confidential content, ends up not being protected. And there is no worse protection than clear text. So saying, since this content is so sensitive, I'm going to protect it with hold your own key. And then this content that is still very sensitive, but not as sensitive, so it has to be shared with a partner. So I'm going to leave it clear text. That's not a good security decision. If you use hold your own key, also use the other two or one of the other two to protect the content that fits into that category. So you can
Enrique,
yes,
5-minute warning. Got a couple questions. Yeah. Okay.
So we can keep both side by side, and you can define labels that point to the hold your own key policy or to the bring your own key or cloud key policy. And the way you do that is when you define the policy, you define the label, and you assign it to one or the other. To the user, and this is very important, to the user, there is no difference. I'm looking at this policy and say there is Contoso strictly confidential and Contoso highly confidential. I just know that one is more sensitive than the other. I don't know what the policy is. And IT takes care of making sure that Contoso strictly confidential is using hold your own key and highly confidential is using a cloud key. Now, again, I want to reinforce the point that you should not use hold your own key unless you're in one of those extremely regulated environments where the law says that you cannot protect this specific content with hold your own key, with a cloud key. And for 99% of the organizations, hold your own key should not even come into the picture. When you protect your stuff, as we were seeing in the screen, you protect it by labeling. So users don't have to think in terms of protection. But then you have other tools like the AIP scanner that can go and do a bulk protection over your file servers and SharePoint servers and discover whatever is stored there, apply classification, and then apply protection. So you can apply that in bulk without the user's intervention. There are other methods to protect data. So you can create, as I said before, a DLP policy that says, when you try to save this data to this location, or when you try to send this email to this external user, I'm going to pop up a message that says this data should not be shared this way. That's part of protection as well. So do not think of protection just in terms of encryption, access controls, and usage restrictions. Include DLP as part of your story. Windows Information Protection can also help you protect your data. In the past, with WIP, you can say, well, this is work or personal. And if it's work, I'm not going to allow you, for example, to put it on Google Drive or send it via Gmail or put it in USB drive. Now, with integration between Windows Information Protection and AIP, you can say, this document is confidential. And if it's confidential, it's business. So do not allow it to go to a USB drive or do not allow it to go into Gmail. So the same restrictions that you could apply based on just the differentiation between work and personal in the past, now you can apply them based on differentiation between confidential and public. So that's a great integration you can do between AIP and Windows Information Protection to add additional levels of protection to your data. Same thing for Gmail. You can say you cannot put this document in Gmail because it's confidential. Other applications like cloud application security can automatically apply classification, protection, or take action on labeled files. So if you have a file that is confidential, you can say you can only save this file into sanctioned services. You cannot put it into this fancy cloud storage that you found that is owned by a Chinese company that we don't know anything about. The user may think that that's okay, but it might not be within your compliance policies. So you should define where users are allowed to save confidential data and where they aren't. So it's important that you do that based on the classification and not just based on content scanning, because users might have applied classifications separate from the content that can be detected. Very short digression about OME. I have like 1 second. So everything I said about protection applies to Office 365 messaging encryption. There is a lot of confusion in the market about this. OME is AIP. OME is the same protection, same method, same technology. It's just a different way to apply protection. You can create a transport rule and say, apply OME to this message. And that is the same thing as saying, apply protection to this message. It's just the only reason why it's named differently is that you can buy OME as part of Office 365 without buying AIP. So do not worry about that. Just consider OME a feature in AIP. And finally, there are other additional protections. For example, content revocation. You can take a document that you share with somebody and apply revocation to stop it from being accessed after its lifecycle has ended, or if it has been mishandled, or if you contain the wrong information, etc. I'm gonna skip ahead a little bit to the end because this actually is not critical part of this session. Everything I said, or most of what I said, is summarized in the Azure Information Protection Deployment Accelerator Guide. So I recommend that you check it. It gives you the rundown over the high-level policies on how to apply protection. We are updating that in the next couple of weeks. We're adding additional considerations and comments about integration with DLP and more details on policies. So please do not consider it a done document. The AIP Deployment Accelerator Guide will continue to evolve. So keep checking it and see as our best practices and recommendations evolve. We also have a end user awareness package that you can download from this link that gives you information about how to make your users understand how to use AIP. Posters, emails, documents, guides, and stuff that you can give to your users so they know how to deal with these labels and how to apply them and how to protect the data properly. Please check that. It's also a live repository, so check it often and see if you can contribute to it as well. If you have good ideas, if you get good results with your customers, please send us your notes, share your materials. We'll be happy to leverage them to make more of a community and benefit from each other's insights. Okay, thank you for joining us. I'm going to leave it to Mike to close the session, and I think he had a couple of questions.
Yeah, if you have, I don't know the official rules of the webinar. I know we've gone over, but if some of you want to remain, and Enrique, if you've got a couple more minutes, there were a couple of themes, one of which was tracking, came up several times. I don't know if you can address a little bit about the tracking capabilities. Do the documents need to be protected or just labeled? And what does that pertain? What if you could go a little bit into tracking?
So there are two types of tracking. One is the ability to report and create reports based on where content is, what it contains, how it was created, things like that. That does not require protection. That's based on the labels, and that's available through AIP Analytics and the logs that you can download. And that's actually a very rich source of information. Separate from that, we have this feature called Track and Revoke, which is using a separate portal, and that is available for protected documents. Now, that functionality is kind of outdated. It hasn't been updated in a while, and we are rebuilding it. We are working on a new portal for tracking that's going to have address more scenarios, and it's going to have better capabilities. So keep an eye on it. We're talking about end of this year. We're going to have something new around the end of this year. We're going to have something new for that. The current one has some limitations. In particular, there is a page where you see the documents that were protected, but you only see some depending on how they were protected. What we recommend is to ignore that list. And the way to track a document is you go into a document, you right-click on it, you choose the classify and protect option, and then on top of that screen, there is a track and revoke button. You click there, and then you can see how the document is being used. That's a much better option than trying to go to the portal and see the list of documents there, which is not the most functional aspect of AIP. But again, that's being rewritten, and keep an eye on it, because we're making very interesting enhancements there in the future.
Okay, thanks. I think everything else appears to have been addressed pretty thoroughly in the chat window.
Yeah, quick answer here. There is a question here. Can you apply more than one label to a document? Not today. We're working on something called multi-tagging. We will be announcing something around that in the second half of this year, hopefully. We don't have anything to communicate now, but it's being worked on. And now the floor is yours, Michael.
If you see any other of the questions that you want to add in, feel free. In the meantime, unless I hear you interrupt, I'm going to thank everybody for their participation. Remind them that the slide deck and recording, there have been several requests for the slide deck. They're at the link that I published in the chat window. And thank you for your time. This is part of a 6-part series, so hopefully you'll join us for the other 2 remaining parts. And please, please do join our community. Lots of answers, lots of questions, and a lot of interaction there. So, Enrique, last call.
Thanks for managing this event, Michael, and thank everybody for your attendance and for your questions, and see you in the community.
Thanks, everybody.
Bye.
Bye.